The crisis that could break Russia before the war ends. Imagine a war machine that keeps firing, even as the treasury behind it quietly runs dry. For most of the last 4 years, that contradiction has defined Russia's war in Ukraine. On the battlefield, the front lines barely moved for months at a time. In Moscow, officials spoke with confidence, almost boredom, about a war they believed they could sustain indefinitely. But at the start of 2026, something shifted. Not on the battlefield first, in the numbers. Russia's own president stood in front of his economic advisors and admitted something he had avoided saying for years. The economy was shrinking, not slowing, shrinking. And behind that one admission sits a much bigger question, one this documentary will try to answer carefully, using only what can be confirmed. Is Russia now fighting a war it can no longer afford to finish? This is the story of that crisis, how it built up quietly for years, why it finally broke into the open in 2026, and what it might mean for a war that has already reshaped Europe. Chapter 1. Why this story matters. Now, wars are usually understood through maps, territory gained, territory lost. But wars are also fought with money, with workers, with fuel and steel and semiconductors. And by early 2026, it was this second, quieter battlefield where Russia began to show real strain. Russia's GDP contracted by a combined 1.8% in January and February of 2026, the first contraction since the initial shock of Western sanctions in 2022. That single statistic doesn't sound dramatic on its own, but context makes it serious. Massive military spending had pushed GDP growth to 4.1% in 2023 and 4.9% in 2024, before growth slowed to just 1% last year. The engine that had powered Russia's wartime economy for years was now stalling. Why does this matter beyond Russia's borders? Because how long Russia can sustain this war economically may end up shaping how and when the war in Ukraine actually ends, not just what happens on the front line. Chapter 2. How the war economy was built. To understand the crisis, we first need to understand the boom that came before it. After the initial shock of 2022 sanctions, Russia did something few analysts expected. It adapted. The Kremlin poured state money into defense factories, raised wages for soldiers and military workers, and effectively built what economists call a military Keynesian economy, one where government war spending replaces normal economic growth. For a while it worked. Factories ran around the clock. Unemployment fell. Soldiers' families received payments that, in some poorer regions, were larger than any salary available locally. On paper, Russia looked resilient, even prosperous. But this kind of growth has a hidden cost. It isn't organic. It's borrowed against the future. And by 2026, that bill started coming due. Chapter 3. The turning point. A budget in free fall. Here's where the story turns from steady tension into open crisis. In the first 4 months of 2026 alone, Russia's federal budget deficit reached roughly 5.9 trillion rubles, about 2.5% of GDP. To put that in perspective, this already exceeded Russia's entire deficit for all of 2025, which had been 5.6 trillion rubles and was already considered alarming by economists. The government had originally planned for a full-year deficit of less than 4 trillion rubles. 4 months in, it had already blown past that target. For comparison, analysts noted that this deficit trajectory could approach levels not seen in Russia this century, worse than the 2009 financial crisis, when the deficit hit around 6% of GDP, and worse than the first pandemic year in 2020. But this was only part of the story. A shrinking economy and a widening deficit don't happen in isolation. They're symptoms of deeper structural problems. To understand those, we need to look at where Russia's money actually comes from. Chapter 4. The oil weapon and the shrinking discount oil and gas have always been the financial backbone of the Russian state, and that backbone has been cracking. By early 2026, Russia's largest oil company, Rosneft, reported a 70% drop in profits over the previous 9-month period. And new US sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil that took effect in late 2025 deepened the pressure. The discount Russia is forced to accept on its Urals crude oil compared to the global Brent benchmark widened to $29 per barrel by February 2026, pushing Russian oil prices down to their lowest level since May 2020. Russia's 2026 budget was built on an assumption that oil would sell for around $59 a barrel, but due to sanctions, the real-world discount on Russian oil turned out to be far wider than the $11 gap the budget had planned for. There was a twist, though, one that shows how unpredictable this war has become. A separate conflict, the war in Iran, sent global oil prices surging in early 2026. In theory, that should have been a windfall for Moscow. But Ukraine's sustained drone strikes on Russian export terminals prevented Russia from fully capitalizing on that price spike. Even when global conditions briefly favored Russia, its own vulnerabilities stopped it from cashing in. However, another development made the fiscal picture even more strained. Russia's liquid sovereign wealth fund, the reserve it built specifically to cushion shocks like this, fell from 6.5% of GDP at the start of the war to just 1.8% by April 2026. The cushion that was supposed to absorb exactly this kind of crisis had almost run out. Chapter 5: The Labor Trap. Money is only one half of this crisis. The other is people, and this may be the harder problem to solve. Russia's economy is now operating close to its total productive capacity, facing diminishing returns from allocating more resources into military production. Labor has become an even more severe bottleneck than money. Demand for soldiers and factory workers has surged, even as casualties and emigration have shrunk the available workforce. Strikingly, this is the first major war in modern Russian history where the state has not resorted to a full compulsory draft of its civilian population. That restraint has a cost. To keep factories staffed without forced conscription, Russia has had to pay dramatically more for labor, driving wages and therefore inflation sharply upward. As one economist involved in recent research on Russia's war economy put it, the core constraint facing Russia today isn't a lack of money, but a lack of people, technology, and productive capacity, meaning that higher government spending now risks fueling inflation rather than actual military output. This is the trap. Russia can print money or borrow more, but it cannot print more skilled workers. And every additional worker pulled into a tank factory is one fewer worker in agriculture, transport, or retail, sectors ordinary Russians depend on every day. If you're enjoying this deep, evidence-based look at the forces shaping the war in Ukraine, and you want more documentaries that go beyond the daily headlines, consider subscribing to the World Signals. Chapter 6: The China Lifeline. Facing shrinking oil revenue and a stretched labor force, Russia has leaned harder than ever on one partner: China. China now accounts for approximately 35% of Russia's total foreign trade and supplies the overwhelming majority of critical dual-use goods and military-relevant components entering the country. According to recent economic research, China is responsible for roughly 3/4 of the growth in Russia's imports of sanctioned militarily relevant components since 2022. This relationship keeps Russia's war machine running. But it also raises an uncomfortable question for the Kremlin. What happens to a country's sovereignty when one partner controls 3/4 of the technology keeping your army supplied? Russia hasn't just become dependent on China economically. It has become strategically tied to Beijing's willingness to keep the pipeline of components flowing. Chapter 7: The Home Front, Fuel Lines, and Quiet Anger. While economists debate deficits and sovereign wealth funds, ordinary Russians are experiencing this crisis in a much more immediate way, at the gas pump. Ukrainian drone strikes on Russian refineries have caused fuel shortages severe enough that most of Russia's regions have introduced limits on the sale of petrol and diesel, with some gas stations closing entirely or seeing queues lasting up to 12 hours. This isn't a minor inconvenience. These shortages are disrupting commuting, goods transport, taxis, and agriculture. And they're expected to hit especially hard during the critical July to August harvest season in a country that is the world's largest wheat exporter. Even Vladimir Putin, who rarely acknowledges domestic weakness publicly, admitted the strikes were creating what he called a shortage, though he insisted it wasn't yet critical. But analysts are divided on what this actually means politically. One expert described the impact as unlikely to produce regime collapse, calling it instead attritional, cumulative, and politically corrosive rather than immediately destabilizing. In other words, this crisis probably won't topple the government overnight, but it is wearing down public patience, one fuel line at a time, and that patience does appear to be thinning. One Russian official, speaking anonymously, was quoted describing a growing public sentiment that people feel the country has fought long enough, especially as Russian forces reportedly suffered a net loss of territory for the first time since 2024. Chapter 8: The Kremlin's Impossible Choice. So what happens next? According to researchers who study Russia's political economy closely, the Kremlin is approaching a genuine fork in the road. On its current trajectory, Russia's war effort is likely to become economically unsustainable. This would force Moscow into a fundamental choice: either radically escalate its economic and social mobilization for the war, or scale back its war aims altogether. The first option, full mobilization, is politically explosive. It would mean forcibly directing human and material resources toward the war, curtailing the market freedoms, labor freedom, and freedom of movement that have survived even 3 decades after the Soviet collapse. Analysts note this would be highly disruptive and deeply unpopular. Tellingly, growing restrictions on internet access suggest the Kremlin already anticipates this risk and is quietly building tools to limit political organizing from below before it happens. The second option, scaling back war aims, would be an enormous political admission, one that could undercut the entire narrative Putin has built around this war since 2022. Neither option is comfortable. And that, more than any single statistic, is what makes this moment different from previous predictions of Russian economic collapse. Can sanctions actually finish the job? This raises the strategic question Western policymakers are now debating intensely. Can economic pressure alone push Russia toward the negotiating table? Economists at Germany's Kiel Institute argue that Russia's growing vulnerabilities have created a genuine window of opportunity for more effective Western policy, but only if enforcement improves. Their central recommendation centers on oil. They argue that price cap enforcement needs to become the centerpiece of sanctions strategy, including renewed efforts to restrict the shadow fleet of tankers Russia uses to move sanctioned oil. They also propose tighter controls on component exports from third countries, pointedly including China, and new tariffs targeting Russia's remaining trade in areas like liquefied natural gas, chemicals, and fertilizers. It's worth being honest here about what's confirmed and what's contested. It is confirmed that Russia's fiscal reserves have shrunk dramatically and that deficits have widened well beyond plan. It is analysis, not fact, to conclude this will force Moscow to end the war on Western terms. Multiple experts caution that Russia has weathered predictions of collapse before, and a wounded economy is not the same as a defeated one. Chapter 10: 3 roads ahead. Given everything we've examined, 3 broad scenarios seem plausible, though none of them is certain. The first, Russia grinds forward, absorbing the economic pain through inflation, rationing, and quiet social pressure, betting that Ukraine and its Western backers tire first. This has essentially been the pattern for the past year. The second, internal pressure builds to a point where the Kremlin is forced into partial mobilization measures, tighter capital controls, harsher labor rules, deeper restrictions on daily life, trading short-term stability for long-term resentment. The third, economic and battlefield pressure combine to push Moscow toward a negotiated settlement earlier than expected, not because of a single dramatic collapse, but because the cost of continuing simply outweighs the cost of stopping. Regional security analysts increasingly describe Russia's trajectory not as sudden collapse, but as long-term fragility, a weakened but far from defeated power that will likely remain a persistent military and political challenge, regardless of how this specific crisis unfolds. That assessment, more than any dramatic prediction, may be the most responsible way to think about where this is heading. If you found this documentary valuable, subscribe to The World Signals for more in-depth analysis of global events. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next documentary. Chapter 11, Conclusion: The War Nobody Can Afford to Lose or Win. There's a strange symmetry to this war in 2026. Ukraine has spent years fighting an opponent with far greater resources, betting that resilience and precision, long-range drones, targeted strikes on refineries and export terminals, could erode that advantage over time. And by many of the metrics we've examined here, that strategy appears to be working, at least economically. But erosion is not the same as victory. Russia's economy is strained, not shattered. Its reserves are thin, not gone. Its people are frustrated, not rebelling. This is a war of exhaustion now being fought as much in budget offices and refinery control rooms as in trenches. The question this crisis leaves us with isn't simply, will Russia run out of money? It's this: when a state built its entire wartime identity around never backing down, what actually happens when backing down becomes cheaper than continuing? That question doesn't have a clean answer yet, but it may end up shaping the final chapter of this war more than any single battle. And it's a question worth keeping in mind as we turn, in our next documentary, to the other side of this equation: how Ukraine's own economy and society have been reshaped by more than 4 years of war, and what resilience has actually cost them.